Well, welcome back to Missdiagnosed. It's episode 5. And before I tell you what we are going to talk about today, let me just tell you that it's going to knock your socks off. This is something that about a month ago I first heard on the Mad in America podcast mentioned, and I had to rewind it 3 times, 4 times to understand exactly what the word was. I was like, wait, what? It was a very complicated term, and I couldn't believe my ears. I was like, wait, what? That was a thing? I have to go back. And I've been fascinated with it ever since, because as I've been researching the DSM and I'm still working on the Book of Woe, which is ironically how the Book of Woe opens, is with the topic that we're going to talk about today. I'm starting to index the research that I've gleaned and the information that I've gleaned from the Book of Woe, Gary Greenberg's book. It's about the DSM and the unmaking of psychiatry. And I love how he used this to set the stage, because what I think we need to understand as normal people, right? People who are humans, people who are suffering and experiencing all kinds of stuff, like normal people experience, and we're not ill, we're just normal, experiencing human life, is that throughout history, people in authoritative positions have been making up explanations that sound correct to serve their own interests or interests of people that serve them in some way, or in this case that I'm about to share with you, literally serve them for centuries, for millennia. There have been literal myths being made up as explanations to help people cope with being alive. And I submit to you that the myth of mental illness, the existence of these so-called brain diseases, the existence of chemical imbalances and genetic anomalies that cause the symptoms that we experience, simply give people another way to cope with their experience of life and the difficulties that they face. Only this type of explanation can disempower people in a way that some other explanations, like spiritual ones, for example, the belief that we all have some divinity within us, that we're all made in the image of God, those are empowering beliefs. Beliefs that we have something inherently wrong with us, that we are flawed, defective in some way because of a so-called chemical imbalance that can't be proven, but it's there. It's no different than believing that an evil spirit has caused your neighbor to become a witch and she has to be burned at the stake now or something like that, you know. It's a belief, and beliefs are powerful. So, all right, for this episode, we're going back in time to 1850, 1851 in the United States. It's 10 years before the Civil War. What's happening? Slavery is happening in America. People honestly believed at that time that they were entitled to own other people. Not everybody, but a lot of people did. You know, North and the South are fighting during the Civil War, abolitionists versus people who were in support of owning other people. It was absurd. The abolitionists exist, but they were accused by slavery-supporting people. That sounds so politically correct. I don't know if there's a better word for that. Pro-slavery advocates. There we go. I found that in my notes just now. Pro-slavery advocates. That's like such a politically correct term. But it was very common in the 1840s and 50s for these pro-slavery advocates to claim that black people actually benefited from being enslaved to whites. Very, very common. And so one such individual was a physician from New Orleans named Samuel Cartwright, who valiantly discovered a new disease in 1850. And he called this disease drapetomania. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. But the word drapetomania comes from Greek. So he wasn't one of those dudes who had to have a disease named after him, maybe for the better, because it would have tarnished. It would have maybe become a name, an infamous name, right? I'm so shocked I haven't even heard about this. Like, they don't put this in history books, so maybe now they do. Who knows? But the fact that something like this was ever accepted as fact just blows me away. He discovered a new disease in 1850. So even as, this was 170 something years ago, 172 years ago, people were making up the existence of mental illness to explain certain things. So what was it explaining? It was a disease that caused Negroes, blacks, slaves, to run away. Drapetes means runaway slave in Greek. And mania, we know what mania means. It's a disease, type of mental disease, disorder that causes Negroes to run away. That's what drapetomania is. Now, Samuel Cartwright, this doctor, right, he discovered this in 1850, and he told this, he's from Louisiana, he's from New Orleans. He told this to the Medical Association of Louisiana. This is a direct quote. Drapetomania is from draptis. A runaway slave is mania, mad, or crazy. It is unknown to our medical authorities, although its diagnostic symptoms be absconding from service. It is well known to our planters and overseers. In noticing a disease that, therefore, is hitherto classed among the long list of maladies that man is subject to, it was necessary to have a new term to express it. So, to sum it up, he's saying, I noticed this disease that hadn't been classed in the long list of things that we deal with as humans, and so I had to make up a new term to express it. He's literally admitting to this in his roundabout, official-sounding way, but that's what I think a lot of us don't notice, is that we are so blinded. There's like wool pulled over our eyes, a veil over our eyes, that we've been brainwashed into believing that people in those types of positions as doctors, that they know what they're talking about. They think they know what they're talking about. That's why I submit to you as listeners of Missdiagnosed that the fact that they think they know what they're talking about when they are absolutely insane is so ironic and hilarious. As a survivor of their industry, I can say that. How ironic it is that they're so convinced that their reality is real, and it's not. And so going back to the 1850s, when this was a real thing, 10 years before the Civil War came, slavery was abolished. Thank the good Lord. I hate to say it, there's people here that still believe that whites are better than blacks, and it sucks. Everybody has their own version of reality. More to the quote that he said to the Medical Association of Louisiana, talking about the cause of this disease, drapetomania. The cause, in most cases, that induces the Negro to run away from service is as much, so they're calling it service. It's fucking slavery, okay? I can't even get through a sentence without voicing my opinion on that. The cause in most cases that induces the Negro to run away from service is as much a disease of the mind as any other species of mental alienation, and much more curable as a general rule. See, he's so confident. I really wish I would have been a fly on the wall or could go back in time and listen to this idiot deliver this discovery, he probably thought he deserved the Nobel Prize for this discovery. I don't know. With the advantages of proper medical advice strictly followed, this troublesome practice that many Negroes have of running away can be almost entirely prevented. Although the slaves are located on the borders of a free state within a stone's throw of abolitionists. Now, he reported in a journal, too. This gives it even more official sounding authority, I guess. The New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal. He reported that the new disease had one diagnostic symptom, which was absconding from service, and a few secondary symptoms, including sulkiness and dissatisfaction, that appeared just prior to the slaves flying of the coop, right? Now, sulkiness and dissatisfaction are maybe in different words used as symptoms of many other illnesses that are found in the DSM. Am I right? Depression, feeling dissatisfied with life, moping, maybe not in those terms, but I can remember being suicidal and what many doctors would have termed and did term clinically depressed. And I knew exactly, I could describe in words the reasons that I was depressed. And that's why I was able to, thank God, tell these doctors, no, I'm not taking these pills because I know that they're not going to help. They're not going to solve the reason that I feel this way. I knew it was my thoughts. I knew it was my beliefs about who I was. And I was so convinced that I was irretrievably broken and flawed that no medicine, so-called medicine, no drug could fix that. I knew that. So I give myself credit, and I see myself now in that past version of me with a lot more compassion and love than I did at the moment. And I'm so grateful for that version of myself for not folding. And there were times, and of course, I've mentioned before I was on Xanax because it did numb the pain that I was feeling. Like, I still felt the feelings and thought the thoughts, but they didn't bother me as much. Like, my whole body, it numbed my immune system. It probably did numb my immune system, but it numbed my nervous system, so I didn't feel that pain, that anxiety that I was constantly feeling. I believed that my life was pretty much over and I felt dead inside. And then I believed and I had so much fear that I was going to have to live like that. And that wasn't living. It was just like existing. And I can remember saying out loud that I wish that I would get cancer. And sure enough, I got diagnosed with a cancer that I now believe that I can get into remission within a year. I'm not going to test my blood until March, but I do believe that I can make that condition go into remission. Even though, of course, my hematologist was like, you need chemo. No, not until I've exhausted all other options, I don't. And even then, like, I don't know. Our medical industry is so absurd. But anyway, are you seeing the parallels between this doctor inventing illness and what we've been talking about on the last couple of episodes, where I've gotten into the nitty gritty of the DSM and started to get into how it was invented. And there's a lot more to it than that. There's players that we're going to be talking about, specific people that were involved, like Bob Spitzer and Alan Francis. So much more to cover in that arena, but I'm hoping that you're seeing already more tips of the iceberg peeking out underneath these white caps, these waves of information coming at you. And it's fascinating. It really is fascinating to see the parallels and see history repeating itself, but it looks different, right? Because, of course, now if somebody were to come out and say, oh, tripetomania is this mental disorder that happens when slaves run away, like they'd be like, you're a white supremacist, you know, they call it like it is, they'd call it racism, because that's exactly what it was. But they're still inventing mental illness to describe other behavior that is unsatisfactory, like talking too much or not sitting still or hating yourself. You know, these things that our families and friends would rather us not have are what get labeled as illnesses when they're simply behaviors that are not understood and therefore not approved of. We fear what we don't understand. And usually, at least in my case, and I know that I'm not alone in this, so I think that's why I say usually, what happens is it's the families who are like at their wits' end. They don't understand what's happening. They're afraid. They're scared. Like my ex-husband was so scared that my behavior was going to mess up his life somehow. And it did. It was spectacular in some ways. I laugh now, but it was rocky. And that fear is what drove him to take the extreme actions that he did. He thought he was helping me, and it was in his own ignorance, which, I mean, I didn't have any more knowledge than he did about how psychiatry worked. He thought that the hospital was going to have the answers as to why I was as happy as I was. And like, I never had told my ex-husband that I had lost respect for him. I'm sure he could tell, kind of, but I more or less hid that from him, because who's going to come out and say, like, dude, I don't respect you anymore? It's just not something that was in my vocabulary, and I wasn't even aware of it at the time. That's usually what happens too, is you're not aware of your feelings, and of course, if you're not aware, you can't express them. And so when he told me he wanted a divorce, and I was so ecstatic about it, that came off to him as like, this isn't Caitlin, you know? And in many ways, I acted the way that I did was because I didn't care about keeping him comfortable anymore. He wasn't my husband anymore. He said he wanted a divorce. Yay. Like, I don't have to keep him happy anymore. So I could be myself. I could express things and do things that I wanted to do without a care in the world as to how it affected him, because like, we're done. Like, I'm free. I felt so good. And that got labeled as mania. I understood love for the first time. Because I felt so trapped in that marriage and that relationship, and had been getting depressed about it, because I'm an adventurer. I like to go places and do things. And my ex-husband had kind of grown up in the same city his whole life, save for the 5 years he was in a cult in England, but that's a totally different episode. And I couldn't bear the thought of going decades living with him and doing the same things over and over again, not really being able to do what was in my heart to do, which was travel. And I want to get an RV and drive around, like do road trips, like go and do things and not be tied to a job or, you know, stuck at home because he was trying to build yet another business that he was going to walk away from, and being under all this pressure to keep my business going so we could manage to afford the lifestyle that we'd grown into. And it didn't matter whether he made money or not, as long as my business was making money. It was frustrating, but how can you communicate that if you're not aware of it? And so, and I, of course, had no idea that if you start communicating your dissatisfaction and it pisses off people, that they could just go and tell a doctor that you're going crazy, and they could take you away from your environment and put you in a place where you're not comfortable so they could observe you and make sure you're not dangerous. I did not have any idea that that was possible. And in that way, I feel grateful for that experience, because now I look back and I've discovered so much and learned so many horrifying things about this industry of psychiatry and the industry of mental health, and how it's masquerading as something that's helping people when it's actually keeping people stuck and keeping people disempowered by brainwashing them with beliefs that there's something wrong with them, when really it's an opportunity to grow and learn and apply new language to their experiences and become better humans, which I know that I have become because of these experiences. The mental hospital didn't help me. It was having been in the mental hospital and having dealt with the shame of it and trying to figure out like why people were labeling me as ill when they were the ones that were chained to a desk and like in the daily grind, and telling me what was normal when they didn't know me from Adam, and telling me I was unhealthy when they didn't know anything about me. That's the kind of stuff that made me grow. I'm not going to sit there and let you tell me who I am and what I'm about and what I need to do when you don't know anything about me. You just took a test and memorized a bunch of crap and got some letters after your name. That's so, what I now call three-dimensional. It's so flat. It's so meaningless if you really consider the depth of human experience and the depth of what we're able to become, I guess, what we're able to become as humans. It can't be reduced down to a freaking 1,200 page book called the DSM. They can't pathologize what is outside of their understanding or belief is normal, right? It's so subjective, and it's horrifying what a lot of people are doing with it. So back to drapetomania, several environmental factors could play a role in the onset of this disease, drapetomania. Cartwright said 2 classes of persons were apt to lose their Negroes: those who made themselves too familiar with them, treating them as equals, oh, heaven forbid. And on the other hand, those who treated them cruelly, denied them the common necessaries of life, like freedom, neglected to protect them or frighten them by a blustering manner of approach. Even the most kind treatment by owners would not prevent all cases of this disease. And Cartwright had a few ideas on how, like, what things that he could prescribe that would get rid of the disease. And one of them was whipping the devil out of them. That's a direct quote. Whipping the devil out of them. And then amputation of the slaves' toes was also something that Cartwright suggested to prevent drapetomania. He even had proof that drapetomania was a real disease. He said simply that because Negroes are descended from the people of Canaan, which you may have heard of Canaan in the Bible, because that name means submissive knee bender, and that always reminds me of Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones, where she's demanding that Jon Snow bend the knee. It's clear he believed that God had a purpose in mind for the Negro race, simply because they came from Canaan. Oh my gosh. He even called in some prominent European doctors as witnesses who had demonstrated, using dissection, so great a difference, this is a quote here, between the Negro and the white man as to induce the majority of naturalists to refer him to a different species. And it was because Africans' blood was darker, and they observed this, allegedly, via dissection. And the, quote, membranes, tendons, and aponeuroses, so I'm going to have to look that word up. So brilliantly white in the Caucasian race have a livid cloudiness in the African. I cannot, as a language nerd, I cannot stand how he used the word livid cloudiness in the African. Like, it's an animal. It blows my mind. This was 172 years ago. 1850, 1851 sounds like a long time ago, but it wasn't. It really, really wasn't. It's like 2 average lifetimes ago. And Cartwright viewed this kind of thing, these prominent European doctors, the witnesses that he called in their testimony, he viewed this, and of course the origin of the name, or the origin of Africans coming from the people of Canaan, he viewed this as historical and biological evidence. And from that false evidence, sound familiar? Like believing that schizophrenia is from a chemical imbalance, that depression is from a chemical imbalance, is all false evidence, because there is no evidence that what a properly balanced brain is. What are the number of the neurotransmitters you need? None of that exists. So he viewed all this as biological and historical evidence, and from that evidence, false evidence, he concluded that he'd proven that running away, if you're a slave, was not willfulness or the normal human striving for freedom, but an illness. Plain and simple, an illness. Now, at the time drapetomania was discovered by Samuel Cartwright, I didn't want to call him doctor, no distinguished title for you, dude. The Association of Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, which would eventually become the American Psychiatric Association. See, they've gotten better at marketing just by renaming themselves. It's really a lot of what marketing is using words that convey a certain meaning, that get you to think a certain way. That's exactly what the DSM is. That Association of Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane was only 6 years old, and the word psychiatry had just come into use. Now, if you apply what we know about drapetomania, thanks to Samuel Cartwright valiantly discovering it, it met many of the criteria for being included in today's DSM. 1, it caused distress for a certain group of people. It had a known and predictable onset and outcome. Its diagnostic criteria could be listed in clear language that a doctor could use so they could tell the difference between normal stubbornness and pathological dissatisfaction. Or they could use that criteria to determine whether a slave was running away because he was sick or because he was just evil. Many people besides Cartwright had observed this disordered behavior. Its discovery was announced in a respected professional journal. That just makes it true right there. If you can get it to be announced in a journal or something that gives it some credibility to other people, they don't do their own research, they don't question anything. They're just like, oh, it's scientific research. Its definition, drapetomania's definition, was precise enough to allow other doctors to develop tests that distinguished normal and expectable behavior from disordered behavior or dissatisfaction. And a lot of people who do know about drapetomania did not know or do not know that Samuel Cartwright had another discovery. What a genius. He discovered 2 different illnesses in his day. I'm going to butcher this name. It's Diaesthesia ethiopica. Diaesthesia ethiopica. And that is the malady that causes slaves to slight their work. So if they don't run away, they're still ill. They don't do their work the right way. And he discovered this, and it explained the apparent lack of work ethic exhibited by many slaves. I wonder why they didn't like working for free, living in squalor, enslaved to assholes. I don't get it. It must be a disease. The diagnosable symptoms of this Diaesthesia ethiopica included disobedience, insolence, and refusing to work, and also physical lesions. I didn't get much more detail on the physical lesions part. Maybe from being whipped. I don't know. That's the effect is the cause. It's so backwards if that's what he's inferring here or referring to. And he suggested a treatment for this too. Put the patient to some hard kind of work in the open air and sunshine under the watchful eye of a white man. So I guess the question that I have to ask is, can the thirst for freedom, which apparently it's obvious that that's the cause for slaves running away, is they have a natural inclination as humans to be free, can that be found in the brain? And what I found in my research is that absolutely drapetomania is not a disease of the brain the way it was discovered to be by this idiot doctor. And yeah, I'm being mean to him because he's an idiot. I have very little compassion. I'm working on it. Very little compassion for this, for racism. But this is an example of scientific racism. And what is scientific racism? It's racist, no surprise there, racist propaganda that's masquerading as objective scientific inquiry. Sound familiar? All of this, even if it's not racist propaganda, all of this is still propaganda in the DSM. This is what exists. This is what's happening if this person is acting this way. And even though there's 70 possible combinations of this particular disorder, and only like 2 people could have only one symptom in common out of all the different combinations, and they could still have the same disorder, like, it's propaganda. This is behavior we don't like. This is what's acceptable in our society. This is what's not acceptable. And here's the boxes that you're going to fit in. Fit your patients into these boxes. Give them these pills to suppress this specific behavior. It's propaganda, and it's masquerading as scientific information. Now, the desire for purpose and feeling depressed when you're not connected to other people or you're surrounded by toxic people, that's not pathology. Just like the desire for freedom is not pathology. The unwillingness to work for a slave owner is not a disease. Your dislike of your crappy job is not a disease. It's normal to be depressed when you hate your job and you feel stuck. It's normal human response to be anxious when you don't know how you're going to pay your bills or whether or not your husband's going to get drunk and beat you when he comes home. It's normal human response. That doesn't mean it's okay, right? Remember how I've said when I say that mental illness doesn't exist, I'm not saying that suffering doesn't exist. I'm saying there's nothing wrong with you if you're suffering. There's nothing wrong with you. It doesn't mean there's nothing wrong with the situation, but there's nothing wrong with your feelings. Nothing wrong with feeling anxious or depressed when you're in a situation that sucks or that you don't understand or that you're having a problem dealing with. Nothing wrong with you. Okay? That's what I mean when I say that. Long story short here, guys. For 172 years since 1850, doctors just like Cartwright in many ways have been inventing mental illnesses. And when I say just like Cartwright, doctors who think they're smart and present evidence and have biases that they're unaware of because their beliefs are facts. Doctors just like him have been inventing mental illnesses and presenting false evidence of the presence of biological origins, like these chemical imbalances that we're told we have and that only a drug will fix, when in fact the drug causes chemical imbalance, and that can be proven. They can't prove the existence of the chemical imbalance that requires the drug, but they can prove the chemical imbalance that exists after you take the drugs. You can't measure chemicals in the brain, so how can a chemical imbalance ever be proven? Maybe one day they'll be able to prove it, but as of now, it's all based on lies that we have a chemical imbalance that causes mental illness symptoms. Now, it's thought that Cartwright's invention of this mental illness spawned the entire industry of psychiatry, and that makes a lot of sense. Like, whoa, looking back on history, you can just make something up, and that's exactly what's happening today. Like, to sell antidepressants, GlaxoSmithKline put out some ads for generalized anxiety disorder. Even the name, like, they could have done a little bit better with the name. I'm not gonna lie, as a marketer, as a communication major, like, I am a language nerd. I'm a marketer. I know how to make things sound good, and generalized anxiety disorder just sounds like a catch-all term for not dealing well with things that scare you in life. And there's a lot of things that scare you, especially if you grew up in the Florida school system. I was valedictorian, but that ain't saying much when you went to school in Florida, okay? When you don't know how to really be an adult, you don't know how to deal with life, because every grade in school prepares you for the next grade. None of it prepares you for life at all. It's just, here's how you're going to get to the next grade. Here's how you're going to pass this test so you can make our school district look good and get money. Like, it's so screwed up. Pathologizing the slave suffering, just like pathologizing our suffering now. At that time, it allowed people to completely sidestep the moral questions about the nature of slavery itself. So pathologizing our suffering now allows people to sidestep, and this is my belief, you may agree with me, you may not, allows people to sidestep, completely ignore the spiritual questions. And yeah, there's moral questions too. I think it's all kind of intertwined. But the spiritual questions, the emotional intelligence questions, the existence of our human nature and the existence of human suffering and why it exists. And it has to do with our understanding. It has to do with our ability to express ourselves, to understand each other, understand and have compassion and empathy toward one another, because we can judge. We'll use me, okay? We'll use me as an example. I'm judging hard Samuel Cartwright. But if I had been born when he was born to his parents in the era that he lived in on a slave plantation with his beliefs, if I was him, I would be him, right? That's why we really can't judge, because in that exact set of circumstances, we would be each other. And I think that's what Jesus was saying when he said, "Judge not, lest ye yourself be judged." Because if you do judge, you're judging yourself if you were that person, if that makes sense. It's kind of a mind bender for sure to think about it. But of course, that saying that, I don't know what you want to call it, judge not lest ye yourself be judged, that has been twisted to keep people in fear, and that if you accidentally judge someone or you don't understand what you're doing when you're judging someone, then God's going to judge you and you're going to go to hell. Like, religious trauma, man. I'm sure we're going to have an episode about that, or I'll talk more about my exodus from religious fundamentalism and the belief that if I don't go to a certain church and believe a certain way and worship Jesus and reject myself, but put Jesus on a pedestal and be in love with Jesus and hate myself, like, it's so screwed up that. And if I didn't believe that way, that I would go to hell. Like, I'll talk about how I left that behind and how I've grown since then and how I've come to understand what Jesus was actually trying to communicate, which was that we're all one. I see Jesus now as a big brother, and he was showing us the way through forgiveness. And when he asked God to forgive the people who had crucified him because they know not what they do, right? They don't know what they're doing, because if they did know what they were doing, they wouldn't be doing it. So it makes a huge difference when we do know what we're doing and why we're doing it. And now I can look back at my experiences in the mental hospital and what got me there, and how the depression and suicidality after that, why I was there, it was all based in my beliefs and my belief that those beliefs were facts. And a large part of the existence of those beliefs stemmed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that it was real, and the belief that these disorders were pathological, that you can't get rid of them, that I really was going to be mentally ill for life, and that I probably had been, and it was just dormant in my system. Like, it's just complete bullshit that I believe was real. And that caused me to live in abject misery for over 2 years. And it wasn't until my toxic property manager died that I realized, and the veil started to lift, the wool over my eyes came off, and I could see what that relationship was doing to me, and that he was keeping me sick by inserting himself in my life. And I haven't gotten too much into that toxic relationship, and I'll save that. But now that I understand that it was my beliefs that were causing me to feel the way that I was in all senses of the word, and me not being able to communicate how I was feeling is what scared the people around me and caused their belief to think that I was mentally ill. They were just scared of what they didn't understand, and I didn't know how to express myself to them. And it was easier for them to just say I was sick than it was to they just didn't understand that I was going through something that they weren't a part of, and they felt it was their job to get me help, when the people who are supposed to help have no idea what's going on either. So it's just a big giant guessing game. So all of that is still happening today. By making our emotions and our difficulties and our suffering and our anguish pathology, by telling us that it's a disease, it's enabling us to stay stuck. And that seems like an oxymoron, because it is. We're marketed these solutions, but they're not solutions. They're slavery. We're enslaved to the industry. I mean, this guy Cartwright was respected. Other physicians came up with even more logical sounding explanations for drapetomania's origins after he came up with the disease itself. There were people that believed that the nervous system of the slaves' bodies were thrown into relations with the magnetic pole, and it directed their footsteps northward. It's a real thing. So people took the discovery and they continued to research it in their rudimentary ways, coming up with more official sounding and scientific sounding explanations for these illnesses that were causing them problems. Behavior that they didn't approve of, or behavior that was disruptive and that they didn't want anymore in their lives. Just like how husbands would convince their wives to go see psychiatrists who would then put them in mental hospitals because they were tired of dealing with their emotions and they didn't want anything but a slave to make them dinner every night, essentially. And that was a symptom of the crisis of toxic masculinity and men being completely disconnected from their inner worlds and identifying themselves completely from the outside. That's very masculine. The external is masculine, the internal is feminine. And men did not know how to deal with the inside of a woman. They don't know how to deal with their own inside. My last situationship was like that. I would try to express my feelings to this man, and he would have no idea what I was talking about at all. And so he would just ignore it. And eventually I broke up with him for it. I'm like, you're not even trying, dude. Not understanding each other is, I would say, the major cause of mental anguish and suffering. That, of course, gets pathologized. And 10 years later, the Civil War started, and I'm not sure when it happened, but drapetomania just quietly slipped out of the list of facts, right? And yeah, I think where we're going to wrap this one up. I want to do a part 2 to this, and it's going to be about homosexuality, which many people don't realize, but it was listed in the DSM as a mental disorder in 1952 by the American Psychiatric Association. And I have a lot of information to share with you about that. And I've got some notes here that kind of connect homosexuality being included in DSM to drapetomania being considered a disease, just to continue our journey of drawing parallels between history and today. 1952 was even more recent than 1851, obviously. And people hear 1952 and they think, oh, that wasn't that long ago, and they're right. And it's shocking to them now to think that people were so averse to homosexuality that it was considered a disease. So we will continue that in the next episode. This has been episode 5 of Missdiagnosed. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to Missdiagnosed. If this show has helped you in any way, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. Sharing your experience will help others who are lost in the darkness find their own way out of the science of lies. Please note that while I may go in depth into medical topics and have acquired substantial medical knowledge, I am not a medical doctor. I'm a researcher. I'm a messenger of hope for other survivors of industrialized psychiatry. Because of how toxic psychiatric drugs are, it can be extremely dangerous, even life-threatening, to suddenly stop taking certain drugs. This is especially true for antidepressants, antipsychotics, and benzodiazepines. The longer you've taken the drug, the more dangerous withdrawal can be. If you want to heal your brain and soul naturally, the way it was designed to do, please seek the help of a compassionate and patient-centered physician to start the process of withdrawing from them as safely as possible. It will take time for your brain to reacclimate to life without the drugs, and there are doctors out there who will support you in your quest to save your brain. Never give up. You can heal.